I think we have a tendency to go, hormones equal negative moods. And it doesn't matter whether the hormone levels are high or low or naturally cycling. So we have to be very careful when we attribute moods in women to hormones. And when all of the data was crunched over many, many, many menstrual cycles, it found that only about 10% of the women showed a clear variation of mood with day of the month. And this is really interesting because the data didn't show that all women were experiencing PMS, but it did show that their moods were far more likely to be very strongly correlated with how stressed they were, how their physical health, and then their social support. So there's so many contributing factors and so many variables, but we're constantly told that the main one that we should pay attention to is our estrogen levels and that they are the primary determinant of mood. And they are not the primary determinant of mood. They're one voice in a crowd.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we have the important topic of hormones to up our awareness about. A big part of the experience we have in our bodies is thanks to hormones, also known as neurotransmitters, because they help our nervous system communicate with the rest of the body about what's going on both inside and outside the body. Now, having accompanied my partner through the process of having 2 children, and us both having had many unanswered questions prior to that, and now heading into my late 40s, having many female friends and listeners heading towards menopause and speaking publicly about how they wished they'd have been given more information about it, as it really does seem that it's not discussed much, even amongst women. I felt the need to make a show about the science and about the experience of female hormones, particularly with regard to motherhood and menopause, in the hope that women facing these experiences and men hoping to be informed and supportive to those experiences might get more insight. Now, if you're looking for a show about the comparison between the differences between men and women, or this sort of Mars, Venus, brain questions, or the battle of the sexes, this isn't the show for you. It really is just simply an informative show about the female brain and hormones, and particularly about the changes that take place during motherhood and menopause. Now, unfortunately, there is hardly any research into the neuroscience and hormones of trans people, so I apologize in advance for the fact that this show speaks only of those who are born and identify themselves as women. Now, with all that in mind, we are extremely fortunate that our guest today is a neuroscientist and author who has specialized in the female brain, both studying the full arc of a woman's life in her highly accessible and detailed book, The Women's Brain Book, The Neuroscience of Health, Hormones, and Happiness, and most recently in her new 2023 book, Baby Brain, The Surprising Science of How Pregnancy and Motherhood Sculpt Our Brains and Change Our Minds for the Better. She is, of course, Dr. Sarah McKay, an Oxford University PhD in neuroscience, whose superpower is to make neuroscience simple, actionable, and relevant to your everyday life. So she chose to leave her research career in favor of science communication, hoping to bridge the gap between the lab and everyday life. She is the founder of the Neuroscience Academy, has been the neuroscience correspondent for ABC in Australia, and has been quoted in The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, Grazia, and the Sydney Morning Herald, among others. A reminder, listeners, that all the books, the quotes, the scientific papers, and conversation points are exhaustively included in the show notes, should you want to check the authority of the research that we're citing here. On the website are even more, should I be unable to fit them all in. So please use them. I am real stickler for well-referenced claims. A quick thank you to all you listeners for your support on the project so far. Please keep spreading the word by sharing the shows with your friends. And if you can, give me a 5-star rating on iTunes or Spotify, and subscribe with the bell if you're listening on YouTube. It really helps the algorithms get the show in front of like-minded people. Please also follow me on Instagram or Facebook to be kept informed as the new shows come out. Keep feeding back to me with your brilliant guest suggestions and your take on the ideas that we're discussing. Now, I have been wanting to make a show about these often misunderstood topics of hormones, of menopause, and of motherhood since before the podcast began, so I can't wait to get into this research. So without further ado, let's go. Dr. Sarah McKay, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you this morning down under?
Good. I'm very good. I feel like I've had a full day already. I've done a podcast. I've dropped the kids off to school. Fed and walked the dog. So
my goodness.
I'm ready to.
All before breakfast. Incredible.
Yeah.
So, Sarah, I absolutely love to start just by asking my guests about their first really deep thoughts and reflections and questions about life and the world, usually sometimes sort of between 8 and 12, sometimes a bit earlier. What can you remember from that time that may have had some influence on what you ended up doing in the future?
Oh, gosh, between the ages of 8 and 12, I am one of those people that's incredibly blessed with a very clear childhood memory. And I had an incredibly lovely, warm, golden childhood. I grew up in Christchurch, New Zealand. I grew up in Christchurch, New Zealand when nothing ever happened there. The last sort of 15 years or so, that city's had a series of terrible natural disasters, earthquakes, and also a mass shooting, which is quite unusual for this part of the world. But when I grew up in Christchurch, New Zealand, on the east coast of the South Island in a corner of the Pacific, nothing happened. It was a really sort of safe, stable, working class suburban childhood, and everyone around me was sort of growing up in that same way, and I have such lovely memories of, I had mum and dad and a sister, and it was very safe. And I think that that's given me a real sort of strong sense of self and confidence, and that nothing really kind of rocked much at that point in time. And I had so much to thank, especially my mum, for that absolute unconditional love and support. Looking back on that now, I think I was incredibly fortunate. However, there was one kind of thing that happened at that point in my lifespan, which I think has always given me a real interest in health. Was I got glandular fever when I was about 10 years old, and I had 3 months off school, and I was quite unwell. And I was kind of dragged around to a few different doctors and things. And then I kind of developed a bit of separation anxiety from my mum at that point in time as well. But it being the 1980s in New Zealand, no one knew what mental health was. No one knew what anxiety was. It wasn't even named then. And it was just kind of managed in quite a pragmatic, we'll just kind of get on with things way. So it was never kind of exaggerated and never minimalized. It just kind of was, because there was no mental health conversations. And I often look back in that and think, in some ways, would my experience of that point in my life be different now? Would there have been more concern paid or less concern? Would there have been treatments? Would there have been therapies? Would we have? It was just kind of almost was dealt with in a really pragmatic way, which I now think was incredibly helpful and useful. So I'm kind of grateful to that. But I did become aware of health and medicine sort of around that point in time, and have always retained an interest in that. And I suppose underlying this kind of golden, happy, kind of super stable childhood, I was a reader. Back in the days when kids used to read books, and, I would be the kid that would read the back of the cereal box. If there was nothing else to read, I would be reading whatever was in front of me. And I've always loved learning about new things and ideas, and I would read nonfiction, and I would read fiction, and I would read encyclopedias. And, my parents had one of those encyclopedias that they would have bought from the guy who came around door to door selling them. And I would read anything I could get my hands on. And I think that was just a really great training. I'm so fortunate to have had the childhood I did. I think masses of stability, and then just the space in which to explore what I was interested in, which was very nerdy.
So before we get on to your new book, Baby Brain, about motherhood, and your first book, The Women's Brain, where I want to deep dive into menopause, two topics that many of my female listeners and friends have been asking to understand better, which will undoubtedly be also useful for the fathers and partners in the audience to understand them too. But before that, I want to sort of set the context that underlies what all women experience in a continuous cycle from puberty to menopause, the menstrual cycle. And with that, get an introduction to estrogen and the other hormones, or neurotransmitters, as you call them in neuroscience, that are going to come into play when we get into motherhood and menopause, hormones like dopamine, oxytocin. Now, despite the female brain being very, very similar to the male one, except for a slight difference in the average size, the estrogen component and the reproductive system that it regulates in women really is what sets women apart. Can you start, Sarah, just by telling us the role of estrogen and the effect it has on the body and the brain and moods at different times during the menstrual cycle?
Yeah. Gosh, there's a lot there. So we'll set aside kind of moods and emotions because they're really complicated, and just sort of focus on the physiology. So beginning in puberty, and I think, males and females go through puberty, and we're all sort of exposed to sex hormones that we're biologically determined to receive at puberty. So males start being exposed to testosterone and experience the secondary sex characteristics, get tall, big and hairy, and women become exposed to female sex hormones, which kind of we start to deviate off this, more a different path in terms of our secondary sex characteristics. And we've all been through puberty. We all know the story there. I'll come back to kind of the broad idea of how brains change during puberty, but first, just to kind of dig into the menstrual cycle, and to dig into that, it's really in
females
about this sort of brain-ovarian conversation, which sort of is kick-started by a genetic switch switching on in the brain, which sort of tells the ovaries to sort of start ripening eggs, because we're going to enter into our reproductive years. And this sort of, it takes, sometimes in some girls, it takes a while to settle down, but you typically end up with this monthly cycle. Actually, it's slightly longer in your early teenage years than in your late kind of reproductive perimenopausal years. It kind of starts off at, say, on average about 30 days, kind of can get down to about 22, 23. There's this kind of slow change in the length of that conversation. But I call it a brain-ovarian conversation because essentially everything in the brain and the body is this kind of a continual feedback loop. And our menstrual cycle is essentially set by a feedback loop, this conversation between our ovaries and our brain. So every month an egg ripens in the ovaries, you ovulate around halfway through that month, and then whether if you want it to be fertilized and get pregnant, great. If you don't, and it doesn't get fertilized, that's also good. You'll either become pregnant or not. Most of us aren't getting pregnant every month. And with the release of just super simply with the release of the kind of the ripening of the egg and then the release of the egg, we get this kind of peak of estrogen from our ovaries. Now, as we go through puberty, that estrogen kind of locks onto receptors that are on a lot of cells throughout our body, kind of throughout our entire body and our entire brain. And that causes the development of the secondary sex characteristics in our teenage years. That estrogen also signals up to our brain, and there are estrogen receptors throughout our brain. And essentially all a receptor is this kind of it's like a lock and a key. We've got a molecule, estrogen or any other kind of molecule, and then a receptor for that, and it's a very specific kind of match. And when a hormone or a molecule locks onto a receptor, it sets off kind of a chain of events inside that cell. And cells have receptors for all kinds of things. It's not just estrogen, but for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different molecules that enable them to signal, because different parts of the body need to talk to each other. Now, our brain and our nervous system is one really rapid-fire, very direct way in which different parts of the body can communicate. It's how a signal is sent from our brain to our finger. But we also have molecular signals go through our body. So they're carried by hormones and molecules and interact with receptors. So the estrogen receptor isn't some particularly standout signal in the body. It's just one of thousands and thousands of molecules that are kind of making their message known. We understand quite clearly what's happening in terms of the hypothalamic-pituitary-ovarian brain conversation. That's the HPO axis. Males have an HP, I don't know what we call it, HPG axis, that gonadal axis. The hypothalamus has a lot of receptors for estrogen. We'll set the males aside. And that's kind of what's controlling that menstrual cycle loop, is the hypothalamus receiving signals from the ovaries, sending it kind of to a sort of a sub-messenger, the pituitary, which is releasing hormones, signaling back down. So there's this kind of little loop there. I've belabored this. I've taken a really long way away to sort of explain this point.
Are there any differences in mood that are sort of general? I know every woman experiences this very, very differently, but are there any differences in mood particularly related to the changes in estrogen throughout the month, or it's too general?
This is where things get complicated. Mood is a really subjective, and emotions are a really subjective experience. So essentially we've got our brain, and it's receiving signals from our body, from the estrogen, but also, about the state of our muscles and our bones and our gut and what we've eaten and how much exercise we've had and our sleep. And there is a constant stream of information coming in from our body that's going into our brain that our brain's kind of making meaning of. And then we're receiving constant streams of information from the outside world. So the rising and the setting of the sun, I can look out my window, I can see the morning light, I can see my dog on the floor, we've got other people around us, we're making meaning of the people around us, the interactions we're having. We're receiving a constant stream of data to our visual system really close from the world, because the world is now 10 centimetres away from our, or depends how old you are, how far away the world is on your phone, right? And then we've also got our experiences and our thoughts and our expectations and the words we use to describe how we're feeling. And so in the middle, we've got a brain, and then we've got emotions, which are constructed from all of these different signals that are coming in. Hormones are just one signal that a brain cell is receiving, that a brain is receiving. Estrogen is just one. Okay, so when we take a look at an emotion, or we take a look at and a mood is kind of like mood is more like climate. It's kind of like a long kind of cycle of emotions, whereas emotions are kind of in the moment. Okay, and so if we're looking at what is determining someone's emotional state at any one point in time, there is this very strong narrative that when it comes to females, whether we are going through puberty, menstrual cycle, pregnancy, menopause, when hormones are kind of up or down or cycling or establishing themselves or wittering away, that if we're mixing up a female brain with some hormones, we are seeing emotional instability. We are seeing moodiness. We kind of seem to assume that an emotional state in a female is solely due to one of these signals, and that is a hormonal signal. And that is not how an emotion is constructed. An emotion is constructed based on a whole lot of signals. We can feel cranky when we're thirsty. Okay, you can feel cranky when you're hungry, especially small children who haven't kind of learned how to regulate their physiological state by drinking enough and eating enough, or they're tired. We always say in my family, when the water's low, the rocks will show. We've got teenage boys now, they're getting a little bit better at that. So there are a lot of things that could influence an emotional state. Someone pissing you off, your husband not putting the bins out, could make you absolutely wild. The next morning when you hear the bin truck coming and they aren't out, that's a pretty strong signal for anger, okay? So I think we have a tendency to go, hormones equal negative moods. And it doesn't matter whether the hormone levels are high or low or naturally cycling. So we have to be very careful when we attribute moods in women to hormones.
Yeah, the study we're going to come back to in just a moment, Sarah. So I just want to quickly cover, again, just setting the scene here. Can you tell us briefly about other hormones that are going to come into play in a moment when we talk about features like attachment dynamics between the mother and baby, or brain fog and menopause? I know there's a lot of them, but there are a few key ones, aren't there?
attachment dynamics is something different from menopause, which is something different again from mood. So we have to be really careful and when we're talking about these things from a scientific perspective.
We'll talk about them one by one. It was just to introduce a couple of the terms so that they weren't completely foreign where if any of the listeners haven't heard them when we do introduce them. I was thinking of oxytocin, for example, or dopamine.
Okay. So we've talked about sex hormones coming out of the ovaries, like estrogen, and there's also progesterone. We know far less about that. At different points in the lifespan, in males and in females, depending on the sort of circumstances, there are different signals, sort of molecular or hormonal signals that are released in the body and also released in the brain. Some are synthesized in the body and make their way into the brain. Some are synthesized in the brain, interact in the brain. Some are synthesized in the brain and signal down to the body. So I said there's constant feedback loops. So you've mentioned oxytocin. So oxytocin is both a hormone that is released from our brain into our bloodstream that can influence what's happening in our body. Oxytocin can also be released in the brain as a neurotransmitter where it's used to signal between different neurons and can kind of change the brain in a way where it might think or feel or behave or cause the body to react in a certain way. Oxytocin, we usually hear about it talked about. Initially it was isolated and first studied because of its role in labour and delivery. So it's released in kind of enormous amounts from the brain when a woman goes into labour. It's not that high during pregnancy, but during pregnancy, the uterus starts growing more and more estrogen receptors. That when growing more and more oxytocin receptors. So when oxytocin is released from the brain at the onset of labour and delivery, the uterus is like ready and really super responsive to that, and it kind of causes the uterus to contract. Then once the baby is delivered, then oxytocin also has a role in terms of breastfeeding or lactation and milk production and letdown. And it works in play with another hormone called prolactin, which kind of is involved with making the milk and then releasing the milk. Initially, you need the baby suckling for that kind of loop to get established. But then any woman who's breastfeeds knows that in time all you need to do is think about the baby and you'll get milk let down. That's, once that kind of sort of establishes, it gets much more efficient. So the oxytocin plays a role there, labour, delivery, and also lactation, but it also is released in our brains of males and females in response to social interactions. And it's what we call a pro-social hormone, that it helps to facilitate feelings of togetherness and kind of in-group bonding, but it also has effects whereby it enables us to sort of establish and make sense of friend versus foe. So it's also responsible for what we might call mama bear aggression. So anger towards someone who might be threatening you. So it's not just about positivity or warm, fluffy cuddles. It's also around oxytocin will enable aggression and anger. And oxytocin is also part of, mating and dating and also caregiving. But it doesn't always equal love and cuddles. It's pro-social. It's about social interactions. So it's also involved with like kind of aggression, which, is really interesting in its own kind of right.
So probably not for the last time today, I suspect, researching the menstrual cycle for the Women's Brain book led you to some research that goes against the ideas that society tends to believe about women, which you've already touched on, and I think we'll keep coming back today. In the case of PMS or premenstrual syndrome, tell us about this fascinating study from your fellow New Zealander, Dr. Sarah Roman, that called a lot of these preconceptions immediately into doubt.
Yeah, I love telling this story because we do, as I said, especially young girls, from a very early age, young girls are fed this story. And this would be what the feminists have been saying for a long time as well, that we're taught that when you mix up the female body and brain with female hormones, it's emotionally unstable and hysterical. And that's a long story that's been told by women of a certain ilk. But when I was doing this, sort of the research for the menstrual cycle section of the book. And when I was doing this in 2016 and 17, there wasn't as much information as what we have now. But I thought, oh, well, I'll just look to see, does the menstrual cycle influence mood? Because initially I was like, does it influence cognition? And the really good news is we don't have any evidence that cognition kind of goes up or down at any point during the menstrual cycle. And I could have told you that because I'm perfectly capable and functional, and I believe myself to be reasonably cognitively adept, despite the fact, I have a female cycle. And lots of women will claim that. So, carry on as were. Mood might be something different. And I thought, well, everyone's talking about PMS. Now, I didn't grow up in a family that talked much about PMS. It's not been any personal experience I've had. However, I'm quite aware that you carry your own biases into the research. And I thought, well, I'll just look up and see what's the percentage of, first thing, just basic, what's the percentage of women who experience PMS? Like, is it 5, 10, 20, 50%? That's, you often do this if you're interested in a health condition. How many people does this affect? And I found a meta-analysis, and meta-analyses are always really useful because they pull together very similar studies that are done on a very specific topic, and there's power in numbers. And this meta-analysis was fascinating because it went around different countries in the world and looked to see the rates of PMS where women put their hands up and say, I have PMS, how they define it themselves. Because it has a lot of definitions. It could be a physical thing, but if we're just talking about the mood, and this blew my mind, this meta-analysis, because the rates of PMS differed, and they differed extraordinarily widely depending on where in the world these women were. So French women were about 10% of women saying, I have PMS. Spanish were about 30%, so just over the border. A lot of countries kind of hovered 40, 50, 60%. And then you got to some countries in the world. Iran was actually quite extreme in that it was around 90% of women. And this is quite interesting. And follow-up studies have been done looking at this. I was going, somewhere between 10% and 90% of women in the world. I thought if it's purely biological, if the sole driver of PMS is hormones, why on earth is it so different in France and Iran and with all these other countries? And I thought, well, it's not like French women are particularly, they're pretty happy to say what they think, let everyone know how they feel. I don't see many French women kind of keeping quiet and hushing down about their emotional status. But what we do tend to see is that countries where there's greater gender inequality, particularly in countries like Iran, we see this really high rate of women reporting their emotional status linked to their menstrual cycle. And there's a little bit of analysis that's been done since on that. And it may be that, well, French women can say if they're pissed off no matter when or to whom or why. And I'm being very stereotypical here. The Iranian woman can't do that unless they're saying it's because of my biology. So maybe there's a gendered experience in there. So this research was kind of followed up by this women's health psychiatrist, Sarah Romans in New Zealand, and this is a number of years ago now, because she is a psychiatrist, so she's seeing a specific subset of the population who need psychiatric care. And she was like, I'm still not convinced that all of women's mental health issues that I'm seeing, she said, are solely due to their hormones, because we keep blaming hormones. And so she designed a study called the Mood and Daily Life Study, and the women were not told it was about PMS. They were kind of brought into the study. Some of them were on the pill, so they weren't having a monthly cycle. Some of them were cycling naturally, and they were told every day an app will pop up on your phone and you record your mood. And you were given positive moods, neutral moods, and negative moods. A lot of mood meters only measure, they give you 20 options for feeling like crap and 2 or 3 for happy. So it tried to be very careful on that array, so as not to skew the data. And then women also reported how stressed they were, how socially supported they felt, and then their physical health. And when all of the data was crunched over many, many, many menstrual cycles, it found that only about 10% of the women showed a clear variation of mood with day of the month. So they were more like French than Iranian women. And that's very, very similar to the rates that we see of women who have diagnosed PMDD or premenstrual dysmorphic disorder, whereby they show very, very clear and quite clinically difficult moods in the days leading up to their menstrual period. And this is really interesting because the data didn't show that all women were experiencing PMS, but it did show that their moods were far more likely to be very strongly correlated with how stressed they were, how their physical health, and then their social support.
And I believe there was also mention of sleep issues as well. So lack of sleep, which we'll come back to with regards to...
Not in this specifically, but that fell under the umbrella of well-being.
Yeah, and social support as well, you mentioned.
And social support was the strongest actually correlation, or how socially connected women felt. So if you are lonely and don't feel like you've got a good, strong social network around you, your mood is lower. And we know that because one of the strongest risk factors for depression, and in particularly times when you're vulnerable, like postnatal depression, is social isolation. So that's hardly a surprise. So here we've got hormones, but they're also they're in a context, because the brain is in a context. The brain's not only listening to hormones, the brain's listening to all of these inputs. Okay, and that's determining mood. And so I talked to Sarah Romans about this. I said, well, so what are you telling women, that it's not hormones? She said, it's these other things. She said, no, it's just trying to get people to understand, and this is what I spend so much time doing, trying to get people to understand that your brain is making meaning of so many inputs. And it could be at certain points in time or stages of life, or depending on who you are, that, I often think it's like looking at those old-fashioned scales where you put the little weights on, and you might be tipping the scales more towards negative mood, because you're unwell and your husband didn't put the bins out, and, perhaps you didn't get enough sleep. But we don't know that the hormones might not be a very heavy weight at this point in time, or maybe they're kind of irrelevant, or maybe the hormones are tipping the scales that way. So there's so many contributing factors and so many variables, but we're constantly told that the main one that we should pay attention to is our estrogen levels, and that they are the primary determinant of mood. And they are not the primary determinant of mood. They're one voice in a crowd.
And I wonder how much of that influences women in believing that they have PMS. Apart from the important social element you spoke in, the difference between European countries, or perhaps between France and Iran particularly, but how much of that do you think is coming from the inside out, on how much is coming from our grandmothers and our sort of historical influence?
Well, this is an incredibly, and some people find this a really controversial conversation to have, because what we're saying to women is, we're not saying your experiences aren't valid and aren't real, but perhaps what you're attributing them to, perhaps you're only, because we all have a cognitive bias, and we're very happy to talk about a cognitive bias. When we go, oh, well, it's the hormones, then we're not giving ourselves the ability to look at anything else that we could actually pull a lever on, could actually make a difference. If you're not pregnant and you don't want to be on the oral contraceptive pill, and you're between the ages of 13 and 50, you're probably going to be having a menstrual cycle every month. And so you can't really do much about that. Those hormones are going to be changing. And if you're thinking that they're the only things that are going to influence a health outcome, you can't really do kind of a lot about that. But actually, the evidence clearly shows that if we're just talking about something that's kind of fuzzy around the edges as emotions, that, there are so many inputs which are going to be tweaking your emotions one way or another, including our expectations. That is why psychological talking therapies, cognitive behavioural therapies, are really useful for people who have mood disorders. They are not the cure for everyone, but your kind of perception of yourself and the meaning that you're making of that, consciously or unconsciously, is another kind of data input to the brain. So we're not saying you've all been taken for a ride, women, ladies, or you've been told it's hormones and it's not. Rather, we've just got to kind of, if we stand back and look at the bigger picture of our lives, we can see that we actually have, that actually gives us a whole lot more agency and autonomy, because you may be able to do something about your physical health. You may be able to tell your husband to put the bins out this week. You can work on your social support networks. You can figure out ways to reduce your stress. We're not saying it's all in your head, or it's not in your head, just that there are a lot of inputs.
Wow, remarkable update to our awareness, and amazing that we've seen such a shift in the mental health debate in a trauma-aware society in the last 20 years, but we don't hear much talked about this. So I'm really, really fascinated.
Well, it's by a psychosocial model, so it is talked about. It's just not very social media friendly because it's not extreme.
Yes.
It's boring. It's much more fun to just focus in on one thing and make that really loud.
And from the scientific background, we're also used to siloing information and context, and so studying them in isolation. And as you said, studying the brain in that way is and the body and certainly psychological symptoms of whatever's happening in the body is almost impossible. Never mind a bit fruitless.
Yeah. And I often say, and in my books, I talk about, I've mentioned biopsychosocial model, but I call it bottom up, outside, and top down. So we've got the biology, we've got the outside world, people and place, and this ridiculous thing, and top down, our mind, our psychology, our experiences, our expectations, etc. And I think that kind of gives people a framework on which to think about, you can almost draw it out on a piece of paper, and it separates out. It gives you a framework to kind of think about the complexities of where you're at. But it's nothing to kind of get your teeth into. You can't kind of lobby for a biopsychosocial model. There's no activism around the biopsychosocial model.
Well, I have to say, I think that this particular theme about the preconceptions around female hormones, I think that there is a campaign to be made there, and I think your books are doing a great job. So let's get on to the first of them. Thanks for setting the scene there with these two really important topics that we're going to be focusing on for the rest of the interview. Your new book, Baby Brain, is again a deep dive into the research on the brain science of women, in this case, as they move into pregnancy and motherhood. Listeners, the level of detail in these books, yet accessibility, is profound. So we're only going to barely scratch the surface here today. So do go out and get these books if you're preparing for motherhood or for menopause. Sarah, focusing again on the hormonal changes. And I'm sorry, we cover a lot of psychology on the show. I'm also going to ask you about the changes in state of mind that accompany that. We know it's subjective. Disclaimer made. We know it's subjective, but just give us some tendencies that I'm sure accompany the research. Can you give us an insight into what happens as a woman adjusts to pregnancy? Because again, many of our preconceived ideas about the baby brain are really off the mark, right?
Yeah. So I wrote this book, Baby Brain, because when I was writing my first book, an absolutely groundbreaking study, and I call it groundbreaking, I don't call many things that, but it was an incredibly influential paper for me personally, looking at how women's brains change during their first pregnancy. And it was published as I was writing the book, so late 2016, early 2017. I think it was like end of December, beginning of January. So the date flips around. And that was the very first paper to look at the physiological and structural changes that take place in a woman's brain before and after her first pregnancy. And I must give a shout out to the three women who kind of came up with this idea. So it started back in 2009, and I talk about this in the book. There was Susanna Carmona, Elselina Hoxema, and Erica Barbara Muller, who were three women. Elselina's Dutch, who were working in a research lab in Barcelona at the time. It was a brain imaging lab, and Erica had finished her thesis, and they were driving into the city to the bar to have a celebration. And on the way in the car, they started having a conversation about the next steps in their lives, because they were all in their early 30s. And Erica said she was planning a pregnancy, and the others went, "Oh, what will happen to your brain? We're brain imaging experts. What does the research say?" And they started talking, and then they became so captivated with the idea that they didn't go to the bar. They turned the car around. They went back to the university, because back then you couldn't access all of the literature on your phones that you can now. And they wanted to do the research. And I completely understand, being a neuroscientist, how I would have gone back to the research lab as well, not the bar. Although I did like going to the pub when I was a student. And they realized there was no studies. There was like one study in like 1900 something on the pituitary. And so they went, "Oh, let's design a study, and we'll go to our supervisor and ask if we can run this." And it took them from 2009 until the end of 2016 to publish that study. But what they did was, and some of them, they included themselves in it. They scanned women's brains before their first pregnancy and immediately after their first pregnancy. And they also scanned, because these were heterosexual couples, and they scanned the fathers or the men's brains as well as a control. So the men had not experienced pregnancy, but they experienced parenting because they wanted to see what happens. And they saw these extraordinary structural changes in the women's brains after the pregnancy. And there was about a 4% volume change, which doesn't sound like much, but in terms of a brain, that's the biggest thing that you'll see, except maybe during childhood and development. And it was actually a reduction in the volume of the cortex, which sounds like degeneration, but we also see a reduction in volume of cortex in adolescence. And interestingly, adolescence, and now we say matrescence, the process of becoming a mother, have a lot of similarities. But specifically, the changes took place in the parts of the brain involved with reading social cues. So empathy and theory of mind, so thinking about what other people think and feel, and really tuning in to social cues. And what would be the point of that changing during pregnancy? Well, because there's a new human, suddenly there's a whole new human who has emerged, and you are the brain responsible for reading their social cues because you are the biological mother. And we've known for a very long time by looking at animal research that the maternal brain changes significantly and is reorganized structurally and functionally by pregnancy. We see that in the scurrying little research animals in the lab, and we've known behaviors change. And typically, animals get better at doing what they do as they go through pregnancy and into motherhood. So like an animal that's got nuts and seeds hidden, the mother will get better at remembering where they were. And an animal that's a predator, she'll get better at her predatory skills will get sharper and faster. And a herding animal, like a sheep, there's 100 lambs born that day, her sense of smell is extraordinarily primed by pregnancy to respond to the smell of only her baby lamb. And it turns out that the human brain is also prepared during pregnancy to respond to her baby. And because what do babies do when they're born? Well, they can't tell us if they're hungry or cold or, wet or uncomfortable. They can only do two things. They can cry, and they can also be cute, and they smell and they look cute. So all we want to do, despite the fact that crying is kind of slightly aversive, we just go to them and we pick them up and we hold them. And human mothers everywhere around the world, and in fact all human adults, kind of respond the same way. When a baby cries, we go to it and we pick it up and we try and comfort it. And it turns out that the functional changes that were seen in these women's brains were correlated to the degree of the response that they showed to those babies. So very much pregnancy prepared the mother's brains for the act of mothering, for motherhood, for reading a baby's social cues. Because it's kind of hard when you become a new mum to figure out what to do. So it's almost as if the mother's brains have gone into the state of really exquisite sensitivity and plasticity to learning the baby's cues. Because it doesn't mean out pops the baby and then you know exactly how to mother it and exactly what it needs and wants, but it means that you're primed to learn that quite quickly. And especially so if you've got good social support systems around you to teach you and show you and help you, which is how we evolved. We evolved to parent in like little family clusters. Didn't evolve to solo parent. We evolved, to share that care and to learn from the others, our mothers and aunties and sisters and even, men around us.
And that's an interesting point to bear in mind here that you keep coming back to in your books, this extraordinary adaptability to allow these changes to take place, not only from the hormonal changes happening from the inside out, but also from this environmental and lifestyle changes influencing from the outside in. I know a lot of your early PhD research at Oxford revolved around this adaptability known as neuroplasticity. Mm-hmm. And listeners, we do have a whole devoted show on neuroplasticity, which is often misunderstood as some sort of miracle that means we can do anything and change anything in our lives.
Whoever told you that said that.
Yeah, it isn't quite true. It is pretty amazing how adaptable we are, but it isn't that sort of miracle thing. So in the context of pregnancy, tell us, Sarah, about this delicate interplay between changes influenced from both inside and outside. Some of it you've touched on already. And particularly this idea of new features, because there's so many things that just have really not been a part of a mother's life at all up until that point.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting if we kind of compare, and Susanna Carmona, for example, who was one of the women and did this first study, has gone and kind of looked at matrescence and adolescence, and because we think of these as social, it's not just you've had a baby. Your physiology has changed, your social structures have changed, your body has changed, your psychology has changed, and your brain has changed. And we see this process during adolescence as well. And it's interesting because it's like the hormones, and brains go through puberty too, just like brains go through pregnancy. The hormones have kind of put the brain, kind of opened up this window of plasticity and learning by experience, I think is the best way to put that. So the brain is kind of ready to learn the baby's social cues. That doesn't mean if you're not the biological birth mother, you can't learn them too, but the learning curve might be a bit different. I think what Mother Nature has tried to do is make the learning curve just a little more gentle. But that kind of plays out in some different ways. We'll talk about baby brain, like the forgetful, foggy fuzziness in a moment. But that plays out particularly in women in their first pregnancy. We're told to look out for the baby blues and feeling weepy, but we also become quite hyper-vigilant. We become quite sort of reactive, and it's very common. You ask a woman to reflect back on her first sort of few weeks of first-time motherhood, where our minds become filled with thoughts of babies falling out windows and out the back of the car and down the stairs. And I had a friend saying she brought her newborn baby home, and the open plan living area was carpeted, but she was too scared to walk onto the kitchen tiles because she thought, but I might drop the baby. And I remember being too scared to walk into a room that had a balcony off the room, because I thought, well, the baby might fall off the balcony if I go into that room. And that's because we become very hyper-vigilant, and our entire attention has been primed to focus in on the baby and to just become very, very kind of risk-averse and careful and cautious. And that hyper-vigilance in our bodies kind of plays out in our minds with kind of catastrophizing and feelings of disaster. And that's really kind of a consequence of Mother Nature's intention of us to focus in on keeping this baby alive and safe at all costs. So it's almost like we're kind of rehearsing the worst case scenarios. Now, that should, we hope, in time fade away. And with the second pregnancies, it's not as extreme. You've kind of been there, done that, and you're like, the baby's not going to fall down the stairs. It's going to be fine. A bit more kind of casual. We don't see the same hypervigilance. We also don't see the same extreme brain changes taking place either, because we're already a mother. So our body and brain kind of has tried it out once and kind of knows what we're doing. But if that hypervigilance doesn't kind of dial down, that's when we might see the development of sort of postnatal mood disorders or anxiety, and that's when we kind of need some intervention. So we do need to be aware that it's quite normal to feel that way, and to be unable to relax early on, because essentially Mother Nature wants us to not relax, wants us to keep the baby alive because it's very, very, very vulnerable. That brings us to all of the stuff around baby brain, which is kind of what I called the book after, because again, the sole focus of conversations, or a lot of the focus of conversations around pregnancy and early motherhood, tend to be deficit focused. Like, these are the things that can go wrong, you better look out for them. We're not even focusing in on the upsides, which I've just described, the empathy and theory of mind and ability to keep a new human alive. Baby brain is this particular phenomenon where we say to women, women are reporting, I'm not feeling as cognitively able as I was. I'm forgetful, I'm fuzzy and foggy, and I can't kind of pay attention. So 4 out of 5 women will put their hands up and say, that is me, all over the world during pregnancy and during early motherhood. And if we bring these women into the research lab and do our standard kind of cognitive battery of tests on them, we're not picking up any kind of clinical cognitive decline. You're not like getting Alzheimer's disease. But probably what is happening is the cognitive tests are designed to pick up early onset dementia or, clinical issues. They're not designed to kind of pick up like that kind of, if you're functioning at a really, really high level, and you kind of drop down slightly, it's not clinical, but perhaps it's just enough for you to notice. But that slight drop doesn't necessarily mean degeneration or deficit or dysfunction. it's probably a reflection of the fact that you're focusing on the baby. And on top of that, if the baby's still inside you, especially a first-time pregnancy, you're focusing on the baby moving physiologically and biologically. It's especially at the end of pregnancy, it's tough. At the beginning, it's also tough if you're not well. Your sleep's disrupted, and your mind is just somewhere else. It's on the baby. It's not on the emails. We didn't evolve to remember to check our emails. We didn't evolve to remember where our keys were or our purse was. We evolved to keep the baby alive. And so our attention has shifted. And it's probably a combination of all of these, which means we're kind of up at that kind of higher end of cognitive function. Perhaps there's a little bit of a decline. But essentially what we've done is we've told ourselves this story over these years. Oh, look, it's my brain. There's something wrong with my brain. And we have this strong message, as I said, from puberty through, that if you've combined your hormones, you're combining your pregnancy with the brain, well, that equals emotional instability and cognitive dysfunction. So if a woman's forgetting a few little things, it's not because she's busy and perhaps no one's helping and everyone's expecting her to be a super mum, and a super mum's awesome for everyone else because no one needs to support her. So when she forgets the one or two little things, she's gone, oh, it doesn't matter because it's my brain. So she's been primed to blame her brain instead of thinking perhaps it's just there's a lot going on and I simply can't focus on the things that nature doesn't need me to focus in on.
Any evidence on sleep deprivation and exhaustion at that point as well?
That's a contributing factor. But the thing is, we're not picking up broad-scale cognitive decline. In fact, the main time we pick it up, if we're picking anything up, interestingly, on a cognitive test, so we're picking up that little drop. It's in the third trimester of pregnancy. It's not in early motherhood. Actually, early motherhood isn't picking anything up. If we are, it's the third, and you're getting less sleep with a newborn baby than you are in the third trimester of pregnancy, undoubtedly. But that's probably when the biggest reorganization in the brain is taking place as well. So sleep is one contributor. So what we've got, and I must confess, I'm the one of five. I didn't experience baby brain. Didn't notice it, but I also didn't know it was even a thing. I'd never even heard the term until well after I'd had my boys. So again, there's that messaging in there as well about, then I don't think I'm very vulnerable with hormones. Didn't have PMS either. It wasn't part of my narrative. It wasn't part of meaning I made. And I actually changed out of academia into a science communications role in a big advertising agency working in healthcare when I was 8 weeks pregnant with my first son. And it was a massive new cognitive challenge. And I was all over it. I loved it. I didn't have baby brain, but I didn't know I was meant to have baby brain. And so I wasn't making meaning. I didn't notice anything. And so that interested me, my personal experience. I took that into the book. And what various researchers have done is they've tried to interrogate, well, why are women reporting this? Is it just the cognitive testing's a bit out? Or is there a mismatch between what we're picking up and women's experiences? We're not saying you're making it up. We're trying to figure out what's going on, and if it's not in there, if it's not a neurological deficit, what's happening. And there's a researcher, Winnie Orchard, who has done lots of amazing work in this space. She's kind of interrogated that and thought what correlates well with women who report baby brain. And unsurprisingly, it is, and I mean, so unsurprising, it's how stressed they are, how their overall well-being, in which sleep is a contributor, and how socially supported they are. So if you have women who are very well socially supported, nurtured as they should be, as society should be nurturing them, they shouldn't have to be asking for help. We don't need to load something else on. They're getting the help they need. They're getting support to sleep as much as they can when they can. They're supported with the baby. Physically, they're well. Their stress is managed. They're not as likely to report baby brain as women where everything else is kind of competing. Then they go, oh my God. Actually, the problem is that they aren't being supported. It's not their brains are dysfunctional, but they're blaming their brains.
Yeah.
Which is kind of suits everyone else. Oh, it's just your brain. We can't do anything about that. And so that, I think, is an issue that we need to be talking about more as we keep attributing things to hormones and brains when it might actually be a social issue, social support issue.
Sarah, I want to just focus back, something you've already mentioned on the postpartum moment at the moment, because something that I'm really, really interested in and I want to cover in more detail on the show, and we've touched on it in many psychology episodes, is about sort of healthy attachment dynamics and the important, very, very important period in the early stages of a baby's life for these attachment dynamics to their caregivers, particularly to the mother, but also to the father and to other important people in their family group. So I'm really interested in how evolution has given us the tools for these sort of healthy attachment dynamics. You've mentioned a few already. Tell us in a bit more detail what happens after birth, how synchrony hormones, pheromones, you mentioned cuteness and crying come into play with this magical attachment dynamic between the mother and the child, and how the research shows that some of society's common expectations, even about that, are misunderstandings.
Yeah, I find the word attachment is quite loaded as well, because people tend to think it's almost implying if everything doesn't go right in days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then you're screwed for life. And I don't necessarily think that is the case. So there's a lot of expectations put on women. As soon as the baby comes out, I must attach to that baby immediately. It must attach to me, or else it's going to have mental health issues for life.
Are you also thinking about breastfeeding as well here? Because there's a lot of focus on attachment in that sense as well.
Yeah, you've got to have a natural birth, because if you have a cesarean or an epidural, that will interfere with attachment. If you don't breastfeed, that will interfere with attachment. And I feel there are a lot of people doing some really good work in this space to kind of have a bit of a different conversation around that. So that's why I said attachment is quite a loaded word. Tied up in that is these concepts as well of maternal instinct. So I kind of took a look at that in the book. So let's talk about that first, and then we'll talk about biological synchrony, because I can go on about that for forever and a day. But the maternal instinct, that was a particular phrase I was interested in interrogating as well, because we understand that there are these kind of behaviours which mammalian mothers or non-mammalian mothers perform when the babies kind of are born. You know, the sheep will lick, and a lot of maternal brain research has been done in sheep, which is kind of cool. I grew up in New Zealand. I'm very familiar with what sheep do. So, you know, they'll lick and clean the baby of all the amniotic fluids, and they learn the smell of the baby, and then they've got these stereotypical behaviours, and then the baby learns who the mother is by being rejected by the mothers that it is not its mother. So the baby doesn't use the mother's smell. The baby just learns, that's not my mum, that's not my mum, that's not my mum, because all those mums kicked me. The one that hasn't kicked me is my mum. So there's these stereotypical behaviours. And I think that there's a move away in some circles from not using the word instincts, because it assumes that it's automatic and stereotyped and everyone behaves and feels the exact same way. And, you know, some lambs have to get fostered to foster mothers because their maternal birth mother didn't take care of them properly. So it's not guaranteed. But there was an article that was published when I was writing the book that said something like maternal instinct is a myth created by men, which I thought that's people like a good headline because it gets people frothing at the edges. We like extremism. But I was like, what does maternal instinct mean to people? And reading the comments on that, then I thought, I'll survey my readers, which I did a lot for the book. And maternal instinct was a really interesting one, because some people took maternal instinct as a phrase to mean that desire to have children before you've had them, like your biological clock's ticking. I always had a strong maternal instinct. I always knew I wanted to become a mother, or I never had any maternal instinct, therefore I never had children. Some people took it to mean that feeling you have when you first hold your baby in your arms. And for some people, that is, I felt like I'd known them. We'd known each other our whole lives. It was this instant connection, and I instinctively knew they were mine. Other women feel ambivalence. They hold the baby in their arms and they're like, oh shit, like now what? Like they feel nothing. And other women they've gone through birth. It can be incredibly painful and difficult and traumatic. And they're like, oh, this thing just did this to me. Like I can't hold the baby because I'm trying to figure out what's just gone on. So that, you know, there's a lot of weight around that phrase maternal instinct in those first moments. And people then making meaning of what attachment is based on that first few moments of experience, because they've told attachment matters and I didn't feel attached, therefore it's motherhood is ruined forever. And then other people take it to mean the knowingness that you learn about your child. So you hear their cry and you know what they need, or even a primary school age child comes home from school, and the moment you see their face, you know what kind of day they've had, because you know your child. And that's also perceived as a maternal instinct. So this word means a lot of different things to different people, and people have different experiences, particularly of that, the first time they hold their baby in their arms, of what they perceive they should be feeling. And that can lead to an awful lot of guilt if they don't feel what they think they should at that one moment in time. And so I think we need to be quite careful about how that story is told, particularly if women have a birth with a lot of interventions, is what happens to keep babies and women alive in this day and age. We're fortunate that we can end up with live babies and live mothers. But that doesn't take away from the fact that people have very difficult experiences too. To talk then about, so there's that word, then to talk about kind of some of the other biological cues, or what Mother Nature has kind of hoped for, and Mother Nature, I mean evolution, I use that lightly. There's probably no intention behind evolution. It's just an adaptive things that work last. Is that we do start to synchronize with the people around us if there's love and trust and rapport. We see biological synchrony within families, whereby people's in a happy, harmonious family, we see harmony of biology. We see heart rates and breathing rates and hormone release, perhaps of cortisol, not of sex hormones if there's a male or a female, but we see biological synchrony kind of in happy, harmonious relationships and families, and also in dyads, so parent-infant interactions and biological birth and baby interactions, or other carers and baby interactions, whereby we start to see, you know, you've got a new baby and you're holding it and you're looking at it, and you will mimic their little face. And they might just be going, but with their lips, and you will almost mimic them. There's this kind of to and fro of communication and how we're reacting and responding to them, but also our physiology is tuning into theirs and they're tuning into ours. And that's almost how babies learn to kind of regulate as well. We have to do everything to keep them physiologically regulated but we have to keep them warm and dry and fed. We have to kind of guess at best we can what they need. But then over time, we will sort of start to harmonise with them. And what we've started to see, we've always known about a lot of the aspects of biological synchrony. And we even see this in groups of people, perhaps people dancing together, or soldiers marching together, that when you've got sort of movement synchrony, you get biological synchrony. And now we've started to record from brains to see what's happening in brain. What are we seeing in brainwave patterns using EEG, which records from people's scalps their brain patterns? What are we seeing when people are in synchrony or in harmony, where you've got a really well-attached mother-child? Or what do you see if you've got two strangers who've never met? And what we see when there's attachment and understanding and trust and rapport or love, whatever words you want to use, we see that brain waves kind of synchronize and harmonize. Now, the actual computational analysis of this is super complicated. It's not two brains line dancing together and doing exactly the same thing. Rather, they kind of are moving in harmony, more like kind of one of the researchers, Victoria Leong, said to me, it's more like a tango. There's a response and a kind of a call and a response kind of thing. And that's been done, and there's some research that's been done looking at when mothers are breastfeeding their babies, what do the two brains kind of do? How synchronized and in harmony are they? But that's quite hard because the baby's jaw's moving as it suckles, so kind of disrupts some of the baby's brain signals. But there does appear to be a lot of synchrony there. We've got really good data that I go into in the book. I won't go into here now. That part of the synchrony is eye gaze, and part of it is shared movements, and part of it is spoken word. But a large part of what's synchronizing us is smell, is body odors, and us loving the smell of a newborn baby. You just kind of want to almost eat it all up. Smell is, olfactory cues are an incredibly important part of signaling that synchrony.
Yeah, pheromones, incredibly powerful. Now, it would be an oversight before we move on to menopause, not to mention yet another elephant in the room that is so often not accepted, understood, or supported, postnatal depression. What are the stats on this? What are the causes as far as we know? And what can women and their support network of partners and families and friends do to avoid it at such a crucial time?
Well, I mean, it's one of those points in time in which you're vulnerable, and we now in Australia, and in Australia we have such great social support services. I don't believe there'd be any woman who's gone through postnatal care or maternity care who isn't screened and followed up and watched and whatnot for postnatal depression. And it's also, can occur during pregnancy. And men can. I actually know a new father who had experienced postnatal depression and was actually given quite a bit of time off work. So, we're quite aware of it in this part of the world. I think it's a time when you're more vulnerable, and it's not simply because of your hormones, but that's part of it. I mean, you're coming off the sky-high levels of estrogen, which is really good and makes you very happy during pregnancy, or is at least a cognitive enhancer during pregnancy. But, everything's changed and you're not getting enough sleep and you're recovering from giving birth, and suddenly you've got a whole new human to look after, and you're struggling with your new identity, and you're feeling hyper-vigilant, and you may or may not have social support structures around you which are useful or not. You might have people who aren't being helpful. You're incredibly sleep deprived. There's a whole lot going on. It's almost kind of like a perfect storm of developing this. And the best thing that we can do is we shouldn't be getting the woman to ask for help. The help should be there. We should have very good systems in place in different parts of the world, do this better or worse in terms of parental leave, I should say, not just paternity leave, maternity leave, parental leave. So women can recover and women can learn to become mothers, and women have got good, strong social structures around them. And the best thing we can do is provide all of those social structures around women so that they can sleep, so that someone's feeding them, so that someone's protecting them, so that someone's keeping them safe, so that someone's teaching them how to be a mother. We should be absolutely honouring and nurturing and protecting a new mother as much as the baby.
So listeners, as I said, there is a wealth of knowledge and eye-openers too, a few of which we've already touched on in the Baby Brain book. So we would need hours more to get through it. So do just refer to it, to this as a short intro. And if it's left you wanted, please just go and get that book. But I must get on to menopause while we still have such an important specialist with us. It's this topic that I particularly wanted to make the show about. For many of the women.
Sorry, I talked too long about
it. No, because it's your new book and it's very, very relevant as well. But I couldn't, when I found you, Sarah, I couldn't, of course, not ask about this because it's absolutely crucial. And the two things are connected, let's face it, as well, because it's the same system, just at a different stage. So I think it was very, very timely and interesting. So please don't apologize at all. It was very, very interesting. And the perfect backdrop to this part of the conversation. Now, many of the people in my community, I'm in my late 40s now, more or less around their mid-late 40s, early 50s. The arrival of perimenopause, and menopause itself has creeped up on them without warning. Many of them are starting to speak out on social media how they had no idea what to expect, and they wish that they'd been taught more about this. So they could have been prepared psychologically and physically. So, Sarah, thanks again for being so available to talk about this. I think it's deeply misunderstood, and it also appears to be a bit of a taboo as well, and perhaps even with some shame attached to it, which makes people not want to talk to each other about it, perhaps even between women as well. So, Sarah, before we separate perimenopause symptoms from menopause itself, let's just dive straight in with a description of just why it happens, what happens to the hormones in the body, and the way the changes of life experience of women from what they've been used to all of those years.
Well, pregnancy's about 80% of women. If you live long enough, you're lucky enough to live into midlife. It's all of us. It happens to us all. It's like puberty. You go through it. You've got no choice. You can't slow things down. It was something that all happened to our mothers once, and I think Gen X women, or we're in the middle of it now, thought it would never happen to us. We weren't going to be like our mothers. Oh no. But Mother Nature laughed back at us. So essentially menopause happens because your eggs get old and your ovaries, and they stop ripening and being released. And so that ovarian brain conversation starts to falter. Menopause is technically defined as 1 year after your final period, which happens somewhere, the average age is 50, 51-ish. But, some women think that they're there after 11 months and then suddenly they've got another whole year to go. I mean, it's a bit fuzzy around the edges. Those kind of years now seems to have expanded over time, leading up to the menopause is now known as perimenopause. And that's when it's not like you've got this regular menstrual cycle and it stops the day you turn 51. It usually kind of goes through a bit of a roller coaster, and that's because of that ovarian brain conversation kind of changing and aging. And just to be a bit more concise than I normally am, you'll get, 1 month you might get a lot of estrogen released from an ovary with an egg, and then the brain's going, oh gosh, that was a lot. Can you just calm down a bit? And then the ovaries go, okay. And then the next month might be a little bit less, and then the brain's going, sorry, couldn't hear that. And so there's this kind of crazy cyclical conversation which becomes very roller coastery. And so that means the hormones aren't just like dwindling away. In many women, they're kind of roller coastering. And it's the roller coastering of hormones. It's these big fluctuations that are perhaps causing symptoms in lots of women. Now, not all women experience symptoms. There is a complete range of women's menopausal experiences. It's a little bit like PMS. Some women just don't even notice. Other women are, having to retire early, and then kind of everything in between. When I wrote my first book, the stats I put in there were 25% of women sail through, 50% of women they kind of notice things changing, and then 25% of women perhaps are impacted with their day-to-day life. Their symptoms are such that they aren't functioning like they used to be able to. I think I often say menopause wasn't even invented until 5 years ago, or even like in the last 2 years. I don't know whether it's taboo anymore. Certainly my algorithms on my feeds present me nothing else. Sometimes I have to go in and like lots of photos about things about skiing or puppies. So I get less menopause. All I hear about. It's my second podcast today talking about it. So that's why I'm getting fed it. Also, I'm 49, so I think the social media algorithms know that too. So when I jokingly say menopause wasn't invented 5 years ago, when I wrote my first book, people were kind of talking about it, but it wasn't a hot topic of conversation. And when it comes to not just women talking about perimenopause, and it's Gen X women at this point in time, we've seen, independent, professional, loud women starting to talk about it. We've also seen a big switch in terms of our understanding around hormone therapy, menopause hormone therapy. We call it MHT in Australia, HRT. And the conversation around that has shifted a lot from 20 years ago, when the Women's Health Study came out with many flaws, which prior to that time, lots of women were taking hormone therapy. And then we had this massive, this study came out which scared a lot of women because of the ways in which the study was designed, and then the ways in which the results were communicated, that scared women everywhere, thinking menopause hormone therapy will cause everything from cancer to heart disease to dementia. And so women went, I'm not taking that. There was fear and avoidance. And in the last couple of years, we've gone from fear and avoidance around hormone therapy as being an option to almost FOMO. It's like, if I take it, I'll die. Now it's like, if I don't take it, I'll die. We've kind of gone to this other extreme, at least in conversations on social media. If you look at the conversations that are taking place in the menopause societies and the clinical practice guidelines that doctors and specialists are using to inform treatment and who they're doling out medications to and advice to, and if you're looking at what the research is showing, the conversation isn't don't take it or you'll die, or take it and you'll die. It's not at either end. It's just the state of the world right now. The conversations are a bit more nuanced and careful and cautious and balanced. And I'll say this to women of my generation: if you're only getting your information about menopause from social media at the moment, you probably have FOMO. And you probably think, if you're not on hormone therapy, that you're doing yourself a massive disservice. Whereas my mother's generation were told if you were on hormone therapy, you were doing yourself a massive disservice. And I think in time, as we get more information in and gather more information, one, we'll have a clearer idea about the biology and the physiology of menopause and perimenopause. We'll understand the long-term consequences. We'll understand more about the risks and the benefits of taking hormone therapy or not, for the good beyond the good evidence we have now, which is that it's really good for the vasomotor symptoms, the hot flashes, women feeling all hot and sweaty and their thermoregulation being muddled up, osteoporosis prevention, and perhaps reducing the risk of heart disease. But right now, all of the clinical practice guidelines in the menopause societies can only base their recommendations on the best data that we currently have. And the best data that we currently have does not say take it so you don't get Alzheimer's disease, because the evidence doesn't say that. It's not saying take it so you don't die, because the evidence doesn't say that. We might in time be able to say those things with more certainty, but right now we can't. When there's gaps in information, and we see this everywhere all the time in health and wellness and medicine, when there's gaps in information, they often get filled with quite loud voices. It's very easy to make a claim. It's very easy to talk about relative risk and make it sound really big and scary. And it's a very confusing time for women right now. And I'm pretty well informed. And every now and then I'm like, oh gosh, that's a bit confusing. And I'm also working my way through and trying to take an evidence-based approach that's not influenced by a loud voice on Instagram or something.
Absolutely. And the algorithms do love divisive and sort of attention scaring sort of lines, don't they? Just a negative bias feeding.
If you're confused, think about where you're getting your information from, is my piece of advice.
So quick point on perimenopause, because these changes you said can start up to almost 10 years before in some women, but in other women right just before menopause itself. What kind of perimenopause symptoms are to be expected? And is there any difference to the menopause itself if perimenopause kicks in sooner or later?
So to ask the first question first, if we were really to start defining perimenopause by, a really clear sort of sign or signal from our body, it's when our menstrual cycles start to change from, and we all know what they've been doing for 30 years. We live with them every month. So it's if they become really, really heavy or they become really irregular. And that's like a very clear biological sign that perimenopause is starting, when cycles become irregular in whatever way. And every woman is very, very familiar with her own.
You mentioned them becoming shorter as well.
They become shorter, or they can, you might go for 6 months, or then you bleed for 3 weeks. There's irregularity from your sort of standard that you've always had through your whole life. And that's if you're not on an oral contraceptive, where you might, not be getting a menstrual cycle, or, you've had, and for women who've had a hysterectomy to remove their uterus only, of course, they haven't got that sign or signal. So that's kind of like a really clear biological sign. And then on top of that, there are other symptoms that women report. And as I said, some women don't notice anything, and some women notice a lot, and then a lot of women are just kind of in between. And I do think a lot of the women that are in between, maybe kind of looking around going, oh, maybe I should be paying more attention, based on the fact that, as I jokingly say, menopause just got invented, but the conversation is much louder now than it used to be. I'm not saying it's in these women's heads, but I'm saying we're now attributing signs and symptoms and experiences to menopause that we may otherwise not have before, and maybe that's correct, and it is due to changing levels of hormones, and maybe in some women it's not due to changing levels of hormones, it's due to other things. And this is where the menopause conversation kind of gets it's kind of turned into actually a massive row, because some women are saying we should be listening to everyone and believing everything that they say because everything is menopause, and other women or doctors or saying, well, we've got to be really careful about what we're attributing to hormones and what we're not. And there's some real kind of clashes of opinions about how the conversation even is had right now. And so that's where I think women are also getting confused. But so there's a whole host of symptoms. The most common and well-established and well understood and treatable of the vasomotor symptoms, the hot flashes. And that comes about because estrogen tweaks our thermostat in our brain and the hypothalamus. And it's got a set point, and when our estrogen levels start to fluctuate, in many women, the set point, what our body perceives as too hot drops, so the thermostat becomes very, very narrow. So we only need a tiny increase in our core body temperature for our brain to go, oh gosh, it's hot in here, it's hot in here. Panic stations, we better cool down. And so we vasodilate. We feel hot all over our body as our body tries to throw heat off into the environment, and then we sweat. And that's because the hypothalamus is panicked, thinking it's really, really hot, when actually 10 years earlier, it wouldn't have perceived that as too hot. And that in some women can happen 20 times a day, and other women can happen once a month. That can also happen at night. And I think when it is at night, it is problematic because, one, if you're asleep and you're not being woken up because you're too hot, your heat is still interfering with your natural sleep architecture. So we go through these sort of phases of sleep, lighter sleep and deep sleep at night, and there's quite a clear defined structure of a healthy night's sleep, of the different proportions of sleep we have. And when it's too hot, we even know that if it's a hot night, because it's over 30 degrees or something overnight, that interferes with our sleep. Our sleep isn't as sound because that's being disrupted. So your thermoregulation could disrupt your sleep even if you're not waking up. But then many women also wake up drenched in sweat because they're under the covers and their body has been trying desperately to cool them down. Their hypothalamus has been saying sweat, 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 sweat. And then women wake up drenched with sweat and they throw the covers off, and then they cool down and they fall asleep, and then they wake up because they're cold. And so there's this kind of, you're being woken up. And what your brain is also doing when you are really hot and you are sweating and you haven't woken up, the brain's going, we really need to wake this person up. So they behave in a way to cool down, and they send a burst of adrenaline through your body. And so then women kind of wake up with this big sort of startle, going, oh gosh. And then it's hard to kind of, if you've been woken up at night with a fright, it's hard to kind of wind back down and go back to sleep. So sleep is disrupted. So as soon as sleep is disrupted, mood is disrupted, cognition is disrupted. So it's very hard then to tease out what is the domino effect of hot flashes, thermoregulation issues at night, disruption of sleep, and then all of the other issues. They're all entwined and they're all influencing each other.
And Sarah, just to clarify, you're speaking about these are menopause symptoms, or are we going to see those coming in during perimenopause as well?
Hot flashes start during perimenopause, and in some women they persist well after their last period has come and gone, and in some women they die down after time. And we know that the best treatment for them is hormone therapy. So some women go, I'm not putting up with this, and they'll get hormone therapy, and then they're fine.
We'll come back to that in a minute.
So that's the best understood symptom that women are experiencing during perimenopause. And some women are still having hot flashes in their 60s, right? 10 years after their menopause. Some women don't have any ever. But this is the most well established. And then there's other symptoms. So symptoms that you may consciously experience, like women are reporting brain fog. And again, like baby brain, we're not picking up cognitive decline. Maybe we're picking, if you're a real high functioning person, maybe you're a high court judge, the linguistic gymnastics you might have to do might be affected because you're at such a high level that you notice it. Other women might not notice anything. Is the brain fog due to the disrupted sleep, or is it completely due to the hormones? It's so hard, we can't unpack them. We can't say it's one or the other. It's probably a combination of the two. And then women report everything from their itchy skin to feeling depressed. There's a lot of arguments around mood disorders emerging, and because everyone seems to be arguing all the time about this stuff, let me tell you. Women who are more vulnerable to have previous experiences of depression, or who are particularly vulnerable to developing depression, are more likely to develop it at menopause than women who have had no prior history of that.
Well, this was something I wanted to ask about. Do we know the proportion of women that do get depressed? And do we know if it's really due to hormonal changes, or if it's more about the sort of depression associated with this sort of massive life stage change?
Yeah. Well, depression is multifactorial, and there are a lot of variables in here. And it is certainly clear that, and we've got clinical depression, if we're doing a study, we want to make sure someone is clinically depressed, and we've defined them as that, not that they're just kind of feeling a bit moody. And there's a difference between like moody and having an incredibly stressful time because you caught your teenage kid smoking weed and you're putting your father in aged care at the same time, and then your husband goes and has an affair, and then you're actually also a CEO of a company. I mean, that's like, who wants to be living like that? Can you imagine how stressful that would be? And you're holding it all together because that's what you do. And then along comes menopause, and you had postnatal depression and you were depressed as a teenager. So you've got a perfect storm there, right? There's a lot of pressures on that woman. But if you kind of try and clear out, and studies have done where they've tried to clear out all of these other variables, and there's one very small study that was done looking at, is this just hormones and just women who are vulnerable to depression? So a study was done where they got a lot of women, half of them had prior diagnoses of depression, half of them had none, and they put them all on, they gave them all a hormone patch. So they put them all on hormones for a few months, and then they took them all off the hormone patch. So they all had their estrogen levels dropped suddenly, and a proportion of I can't remember the number. I'm going to make up a number, 25%. It was around there. Don't quote me on this. Around 25% of the women who had a prior experience of depression developed depressive symptoms when the patch was removed. Of the women who'd never had depression before, 0% of them did. So there's definitely a vulnerability. So women who have had prior experiences of depression are more vulnerable when we go through times of stress. And that could be stress from a divorce, stress from a natural disaster, stress from your biology and physiology changing.
Well, that's great. You've covered almost all of the symptoms that I wanted to go through there. So thank you. The last one, many women and their partners worry that sex drive will drop after menopause and that sex becomes more uncomfortable physically. You've got a whole section in your book about hormones and sex drive. Is this a myth, or is there something to it?
I think there's a couple of pieces to this pie, this sex pie. It does physically become more uncomfortable because what we also know, I've been talking a lot about the brain kind of symptoms and signs of menopause and the role of estrogen. I haven't kind of talked about what happens down below, and we know that there are what's the best way I can say it? I don't want to use the words vaginal atrophy because that sounds very dramatic and terrible, but there are changes in our vaginas when we lose the estrogen that we've had all the way through our lives. So physically, sex can become a whole lot more difficult and a whole lot more uncomfortable for many women. So that's a contributing factor to sex drive, whether or not you want to kind of get it on or not. But also, we've got, you might have been married to someone for 30 years. You might not just be wanting to get it on after 30 years of lying in bed next to the same person in the same way you did when you'd only been in bed with them for 3 weeks. You could not keep your hands off each other. Okay, so there's a lot of different like factors to take into account here. But we do know that hormones, and it's not just the estrogen levels that lower, it's kind of the interplay of all of this, which can determine your sex response sort of cycle, like wanting to do it and then also responding once you sort of start, like once you kind of get in the canoe and start paddling. As lots of women say, you might not actually want to. Once you get in and you sort of start paddling the canoe, you can kind of get going without wanting to sound trite. So there is the sort of the physical kind of mechanics of sex being more painful. And once sex is painful, you don't want to do it again. Why would you want to do that? And then, depends on like the state of your relationship. There is some research I talked about in the book, which was reported by one researcher who was interested in women who are embarking on brand new relationships in their 50s. So they were menopausal, and then they were embarking on a brand new relationship, and were they wanting to sort of jump on their partners like a teenager might. And these women reported being very, very keen, and reported quite a high sex drive with their new partners. Once they could kind of get around the difficulties of the mechanics, their desire was definitely still there with a new partner. And that's very different to the desire a woman may feel towards her husband.
And regarding the mechanics,
so it's a complex psychosocial, emotional, physical issue when we're talking about sex drive.
And I'm sorry to mention the mechanics. It is a difficult topic, but it is important. Are you talking about?
Are you talking about that? I'm used to.
Yeah, well, they're connected. They're so connected. They're so connected. What you're referring to is about natural juices, I'm imagining, and also muscle consistency. Are those the two elements that you're speaking about?
So vaginal dryness is a very, very common experience that women have. And also the tissues just kind of get thinner and more fragile down there.
So it could be painful.
This robust kind of organ, which can take a good pounding anymore, without wanting to sound crass. It needs to be treated with a little bit more care and delicacy.
And it could be painful. Right.
Yeah, it can be painful. Yeah. And then once sex is painful, no one wants to be doing that.
I just want to come back to HRT for a moment. There's a certain amount of women that simply just can't take it as they get bad side effects. And for another portion of women, they just don't work. But the development of this treatment really has massively improved the experience of particularly of that segment of society of women who really are suffering from these symptoms, particularly the hot flushes and the sleep problems that are associated with that, and possible depression that could be the very closely related to sleep. Probably the most important mental health metric in the world, listeners. And I'm desperately looking to speak with my favorite sleep scientist at Berkeley, but he's so famous now. If any audience members have some suggestions of
Matthew Walker.
Yes, Matt Walker.
He's just maybe he's jumping on the menopause marketplace. He's just started talking about women's sleep.
Interesting. Well,
dude never, women are a niche, you see. Dude never mentioned women's sleep and menopause and pregnancy until the last couple of months.
Well, I would absolutely love any suggestions, listeners, for other sleep specialists. I would be at the door, because it is absolutely the foundation rock of all other mental health issues. But apart from that, those women have had their lives extraordinarily assisted by this HRT therapy. Very, very quickly, Sarah, how does it work? Many of my listeners will be non-interventionalists regarding medicine and surgery, preferring to only interfere with natural therapies or lifestyle assistance, and only use medicine as a last resort. So just tell us the nuts and bolts of how it works, and just how natural or unnatural it really is.
I think it is essentially, it's a hormone replacement, and there are many. So it replaces estrogen, and if you still have a uterus, so you haven't had a hysterectomy to remove your uterus, you also have to take a form of progesterone. And there's different synthetic or so-called bio-body identical forms out there, which are like atom by atom identical, but the synthetic ones were also used for many, many years as well. And the oral contraceptive pill contains synthetic hormones too. They act on the same receptors and pretty much do the same thing. So essentially that replaces the hormones, and it's important if you've still got the uterus that you have the progesterone, because one of the effects of estrogen on a non-reproductive uterus is to kind of cause it to kind of grow the endometrial lining, which can turn into cancer. So that's why typically you've got the estrogen and the progesterone, and it's various forms, whether it's the synthetic form or the body identical form. And we know that we have great success treating women who have the hot flash, the vasomotor symptoms, because we know it resets the thermostat. And in many women, but not all women, but in many women, their sleep will also improve. And then in many women, we also see knock-on effects as well, whether it's the sleep or whether it was, and I'll put it out there, part of it's going to be placebo, because no matter what medication you take, even surgery, there's always a placebo component, which is your expectation that your symptoms will improve. And that's going to be part of it. And shoot me down for saying that. But when menopause, it's no different from any other hormone.
It's a fact of all treatments. It's a fact of all treatments.
Yeah. I think perhaps the oral contraceptive pill does prevent pregnancy, not because you just thought your way out of it.
I'm not saying it's the cause of the treatment, but it's an element.
Particularly when we have subjective symptoms in which we are talking about things like moods or sensations in our body, etc. We also know that it reduces the risk of osteoporosis in some women. And this is where it starts to get difficult. We've got good evidence for vasomotor symptoms, good evidence for osteoporosis. Depression, it improves in some women if the cause of their depression was solely due to the changing fluctuation levels of hormones. But in some women, their depression may also be contributed to by other variables as well. So we can't just take the hormone and think everything will be fine. I'm going to have this rampantly brilliant sex life with my husband of 30 years. I'm never going to get osteoporosis. I'm never going to get dementia. I don't have to do anything anymore. I don't have to eat well. Everything will suddenly magically get better. And that's kind of, I don't think women genuinely believe that. But some of the messaging does seem to be going to the extremes that if you don't take hormone therapy, you are doing yourself a health disservice. You are causing damage. You are increasing risk.
Is that marketing or hype? I mean, hype amongst people rather than marketing from pharmaceuticals?
I think it's hype a little bit more. It probably depends where you are in the world, how influential the marketing is on that. Because as I say, the menopause societies and the clinical practice guidelines and the research that's informing them is usually more cautious because first, do no harm. We don't want to be just putting people on pharmaceuticals for no good reason. So there's that messaging in there as well. But broadly speaking, most women are going to see benefits if they want to take it, and it's probably not going to be causing harm, especially if they start taking that during the perimenopause and, they take it as long as they need to manage their symptoms. Where the kind of issues start to arise is what can we kind of say with certainty about increases or decreases in risks much longer down the track. And that's where the science starts to get a little bit more muddly, because we've got different studies that have been done on women who start taking it at different times through their menopausal life. They start taking it in their 40s when they're perimenopausal. Some women in the Women's Health Initiative study that came out in 2002 were starting on it in their 70s and 80s. They were really old. They're 20 years past menopause and they were putting estrogen back in. And those are the women where we seem to see the increased health risks, the negative health consequences of breast cancer and heart disease, etc. Women who are taking it younger, we don't seem to see the same increased risk. However, it is complicated by the fact that there are different types of hormones. Some you take as a pill, and if you take it as a pill, it gets metabolized by your liver before it goes through your body, and that can increase the risk of, say, blood clots in some women. If you take it through your skin, it doesn't have to go through your liver, so it doesn't increase the risk of blood clots. So when you're looking at all of the studies on all of the risks, you're looking at different formulations, different women at different times and stages, different states of physiological health. When there's a healthy cell theory, it's not just the window of opportunity, it's how healthy are you when you start on this. And then, some women can take estrogen only because they don't have a uterus. Other women need progesterone only, and need to add the progesterone form in. And sometimes when you add that in, it can have a long-term negative consequence. And we see risk rising and falling at different points in the lifespan. So it gets very, very complicated. It's not just take it and 100% of everyone will be completely fine in 30 years' time. We're having to make menopause societies and clinical practice guidelines have to make recommendations conservatively based on the best information that we currently have. And right now, the best information that we currently have, I almost say it's like these say we just talk about Alzheimer's disease, because that's kind of my jam, dementia being an umbrella and Alzheimer's disease being one of the main types of diseases that gives you symptoms of dementia. I think about it like being those old-fashioned scales where you can put like kind of risks on one side and protective factors on the other. Like what's going to tip the scales in your favour one way or another? And you've got your genes. Maybe you've got genes for Alzheimer's. It's going to tip it strongly towards a risk for Alzheimer's. But then you've got a healthy diet and you've got exercise. Perhaps you're born into a really high socioeconomic group, which is helpful, versus being born into poverty, which is unhelpful. You can't do anything about that a lot of the time. You've got, your intellectual and engagement throughout your career and how much education you received, and that's all very protective. The more kind of cognitively engaged and stimulated you are. But then perhaps you have a head injury. Perhaps you fell off your bike and knocked your head, or perhaps you're a professional sports player. Head injuries are a negative risk factor. Depression is a negative risk factor. Hearing loss is a negative risk factor. Loneliness is a negative risk factor. Good, strong social support is a positive benefit. And then we've got hormones. And we know estrogen is beneficial because if we look back over the lifespan, we know that pregnancies and the oral contraceptive pill, they provide protection, neuroprotection. But we don't know about hormone therapy just yet. We don't know how heavy that weight is. Because we're not quite sure on the data yet. And it's probably going to be helpful, but we're not sure how helpful. And we're not sure if in some women, in some formulations, it might be harmful. It's like we don't quite know the details about that weight yet. We don't quite know which side it's going to level out on.
And I feel like this is the takeaway from your perspective today. Thank you so much, Sarah, for pulling it out, because I find this is trying to be a multidisciplinary podcast, and we just find so much that science is sort of siloed into these artificially isolated studies where we're making a whole bunch of assumptions, where we're trying to pull something out of its context in order to study it in isolation, which is just not the way reality works. So it's immediately dislocated from reality. And everything you've said today just reminds me how we really need to see this as an enormous ecosystem, not only of chemicals and neurotransmitters, neurofirings, not all of this physical stuff, but also downward stuff as well, coming back into the body through our moods, through our intentions, through our attitudes, and the environment. You've got the environment, you've got people, you've got so many different things. And I think this, right, and we're certainly going to be covering this. By the way, those of you listening, Sarah has several times picked up her phone and talked about this thing, this enormous phenomena in our lives at the moment. And it's getting in there at early ages, earlier and earlier ages, affecting brain development. So the big takeaway for me...
It's affecting all of us, because those of us particularly who are also online, and I'm probably a bit too extremely online, we don't just have to make meaning of all of the signals that are coming in from that phone. We're meant to then share our non-offensive opinion back out into the world as well. We're meant to then share back onto that device what we thought about the information coming in. Once upon a time, things happened beyond the horizon, and it didn't matter. We might have heard about it on the TV news at mum and dad's house, read it in the paper. Now we're constantly receiving information. And if you're a Gen X woman on Instagram, you're receiving information about menopause.
But just a last thought then on this really crucial takeaway about nuance in medical research, in brain research, in psychology, where there's just so many things influencing what could be causing it. Is there any last point to take away here? I know you've mentioned it several times. How would you advise the listeners to be nuanced in the way they're picking up health information, in the way they're thinking about changes in their life, both psychologically and physically? What's the best approach of sort of staying agnostic, not taking things too seriously, letting sort of natural resilience still play a role, despite the fact that we understand more and more these mental and physical health issues? What's your sort of closing advice for the listeners on this almost, I feel like Nuance is going extinct. I feel like it's almost an impossible thing anymore. Any last thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yeah, it's really disappointing. I think I wish I could throw my phone away sometimes.
Brilliant Instagram page, by the way, listeners. She's got such a good Instagram page. Do follow it. But sorry, that's ironic.
Someone does want to not throw their phone away on my Instagram and on my social. I keep coming back to a biopsychosocial approach. The brain is receiving data from our body, from the outside world, and from our previous experiences. And I get people to, in my classes and my students, I get them to draw a diagram. So let's get a piece of paper and put a brain in the corner, put sleep or something. And then I say, right, on the bottom left-hand corner, let's write down what's happening in our biology, what you think's going wrong, what you think you could improve, what's happening in the world around you, the stressful events out there, your relationships, you know, how absorbed are you in the natural world or not? You know, what's happening out there, what can be improved on or not, and then top down, you know, have you got a mood disorder? Are you ruminating? Have you got an expectation? And then when they've got that written on a piece of paper, literally in front of them, then you're stepping back from your life and you're looking at it on a piece of paper. And then you can kind of see where we can sort of start to make tweaks and improvements. And then I get people to use that as a data gathering tool. I'm like, if you're listening to messages about health, listening to messages about menopause or women's health or anything, you know, how can you fit it into this framework to help you make more sense in a really big picture perspective? It's a holistic take on what's happening.
Holistic, great word. I mean, my analogy here is an ecosystem. You know, just look at it the way complexity theory works in an ecosystem. And you just say all of these things are there. They're in the ecosystem. They have their effect and they all play a role. You remove any one of them and there will be a slight change in the entire system. And I think we just have to see it that way and stop having this sort of dream of science from 150 years ago that we were going to explain everything and we were going to know what everything did individually.
Well, science is a process. It's not a set of facts. And I think, and I've talked about feedback loops quite a lot of the time, because like you say, you tweak one thing, it will have an impact on something else. So there's feedback loops in there. And then the main message I can give to people is if there's one thing to focus on that you haven't already got absolutely down pat as sleep. Like if you can get sleep as if that's one thing that you have to choose to focus on, choose what's easiest, obviously, but sleep is perhaps the foundation on which it will make everything else easier to build. Because if you have one night's sleep wrecked, you know how you feel the next day. You have days, weeks, months, years. Everything else will fall down around you.
So we have come to the end of our time together, Sarah. It's amazing how much info you've managed to pack in before it's even breakfast for you down there in Australia. Please, listeners, do go off, get yourself a copy of these 2 treasure chests of knowledge that Dr. McKay has compiled from so many studies, and she's written them up in this fun, accessible way. If you're a coach, a therapist, or a mental health or well-being practitioner, do check out Sarah's online neuroscience academy, which, like her books, is trying to make all the neuroscience lab studies accessible to a less specialized audience so we can really use it and make the most of these insights from the field of neuroscience. The link is in the show notes, along with everything else that we've discussed today, the science papers, the books, the comments. Do you have any other news, anything you've got coming up that you'd like to share with the listeners just to close, Sarah?
I mean, my online courses, please, if you want a bit of professional development training in applied neuroscience, that's my jam. That's what I try and do. I'm busy working away on another book at the moment for the very well-known For Dummies brand. So I'm writing a book on brain health for dummies, where I'm trying to include all of the factors and all of the levers and the biopsychosocial kind of model in the middle of all of that. So that's, writing a book is always, I don't know why I'm doing another one, but anyway, so I am. So keep an eye out for that.
You're very, very good at it, Sarah, so please don't stop.
I'm turning 50 next January. I'm thinking of having a year off just to kind of please myself. So we'll see what happens.
Dr. Sarah McKay. Thank you.
You're welcome.